Hello, everyone. This is Joseph Holbrook. I am bringing you another installment in my lecture series on religion in Latin America. Uh, the notes are taken from Justo Gonzalez's book, Christianity in Latin America, and today we are going to be discussing chapter 6, I believe it is, The Church's New Place. This is the period of time after the Wars of Independence, in which the new Spanish republics threw off their dependence on the King of Spain and broke away from the Spanish Empire during the Napoleonic period. So let's begin. This is a picture of Juan Domingo Perón, the caudillo of Argentina in the 1940s. So the period of time that we're talking about is the 1930s through the 1960s in Latin America. And during this period of time, there's a paradox of continuity and change. The 19th and 20th centuries were a time when the institutional church stumbled and perhaps nearly fell, depending on your perspective. By the 1880s, many powerful interest groups saw the church throughout Latin America as one of the chief stumbling blocks to progress. I've talked before, I think, about the perennial struggle in Latin America between liberals and conservatives in the 19th century, and the liberals certainly viewed the church as a stumbling block to education, enlightenment, progress, scientific achievement. Populism was something that began to arise in the early 20th century as a result of mass movements. There was a mass migration of people from the countryside to the cities, large numbers of people immigrating from Eastern and Southern Europe, and these gave way, also with the invention of the radio, this gave way to mass political movements that changed the nature of politics and gave rise to what we would today call populists. The populists were also often caudillos, military strongmen. So let me continue. Some of the charismatic populists of this time period in the early 1930s included Juan Domingo Perón. I showed you a picture of him already, of Argentina. Getulio Vargas is another populist in Brazil. Um, these were two of the main examples of populism in Latin America. There was also, to a lesser extent, Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico. The populist in Colombia, Jorge Eliezer Gaitán, was assassinated in 1944, leading to an outburst of violence that continued in the mid 1940s through the mid 1950s, almost 10 years, resulting in a couple 100,000 deaths and conflict, guerrilla warfare between liberals and conservatives. The church was pushed off center stage and relegated to a supporting role during this period of time. For many people, it became irrelevant. And when populists did come to power, as in the case of Jorge Domingo Perón of Argentina, when they made strategic alliances with the church, it's because they needed to use the church as a political tool, as a means to forestall unrest and add legitimacy to their regimes. Perón did this, for example, in Argentina. He manipulated the church to his advantage. The church also was reacting to perceived threats such as all the isms, nationalism, liberalism, communism, and Protestantism are some of the most prominent isms. This is Getulio Vargas, the populist caudillo of Brazil. An exception to the rule was the Colombian Catholic Church, which in the mid 1890s, the conservatism established its dominance in Colombian politics, and the Catholic Church controlled the Conservative Party. So in the early part of the 20th century in Colombia, there were often situations in which the Catholic archbishop would nominate the conservative political candidate for presidency, who would then be automatically elected because of the Conservative Party dominance, leading to a situation in which the Catholic Church nearly controlled the state in Colombia for the early part of the 20th century. Corporatism is a view that society is a harmonious organism and that each social group or class should have its own place as part of the organism, a function, and it should know its place and submit to the authority above it. Some prominent examples of corporatist regimes were Franco's regime in Spain in the 1950s and also in Portugal. And Juan Perón attempted to emulate this in Argentina. The Brazilian church sought indirect influence on the state and with society through an approach called Neo-Christendom, with action into the political sphere as a reality in World War II. Christendom is when the church and the state are combined in one political figurehead, such as Constantine when he became the Roman emperor, and he also had tremendous authority and influence over the Catholic Church, and he made the Catholic Church the official religion of the state. That's Christendom. Neo-Christendom in the 20th century in Colombia, even the 19th century, is when there was no longer a constitutional guarantee of the union of the state and the Catholic Church. Therefore, the Catholic Church resorted to a more indirect form of authority. Instead of through the political figures, the state, the government, it tried to dominate or have a dominant influence on society through the actions of its lay people and through other forms of indirect influence. Catholic action and the Christian Democrat parties were two of the strategies for Catholics to carry out this indirect influence on society. The first cardinal named in Latin America was a Brazilian bishop named Sebastião Leme. He was named by Pius XI in 1930. In 1937, Getulio Vargas declared the Estado Novo, which means new state, in response to a communist rebellion, and he took the opportunity to close down the Acción Integralista Brasileira, which was a right-wing integralist group advocating for a corporatist government, and he suspended the Constitution. He took a turn to the left and distanced himself from the church at that time. So it's important to know the historical context. The Latin American economies had become export-based. Often they focused on exporting a single commodity. For example, sugar from Brazil, coffee from Colombia and Costa Rica, bananas from Honduras, tin from Bolivia, copper, I believe, from Chile, beef and hides, leather goods from Argentina. These are some of the examples of the export-based economies in Latin America, and many times it was monoculture. That is, a country would depend on one single massive export product instead of a variety, which left them very vulnerable to the vagaries of international trade. In the case of Argentina and Perón, the Argentine Catholic Church liked Perón's positions on divorce. He was opposed to it. Separation of church and state, religious education. He said all the right things. He checked the right boxes to get the Argentine church to support him, as they did in his 1943 political coup. Having military support to make Argentina more Catholic was too much for the church to resist. There was a huge temptation with their Christendom mentality. In the 1950s, there began to be strain between the church and the Perón government. Perón was basically using the church as a political tool to manipulate the Argentine society, and they began to realize that they were being taken advantage of. In retaliation, in 1954, some priests and bishops joined in the uprising against Perón. And in retaliation, Peronists burned Catholic churches, schools, and killed some priests. Fairly severe reaction there. Finally, the church and the military came together to overthrow Perón in 1955. Probably was a big mistake for him to do that. These are some more pictures of Juan Domingo Perón, who left an enduring and indelible mark on Argentine society. This is a picture of Cardinal Dom Sebastião Leme of Brazil, the first archbishop to be named in Latin America. This is Plutarco Elias Calles. He was president of Mexico following Lázaro Cárdenas. The Mexican Revolution actually came to an end and was consolidated under Lázaro Cárdenas, who carried out an ambitious land redistribution program and was himself a populist. Plutarco Elias Calles was not only anti-clerical, he was anti-religious, fiercely so. And in the 1917 Mexican Constitution, which was a constitution written as a result of the revolution, pretty severe restrictions were placed on the Catholic Church and on priests to limit their participation in political spheres in the government. And so, but despite the fact that was 1917's constitution, by the late 1920s, it had not been enforced. But when Plutarco Calles came to power in 1924, he began to enforce the 1917 Constitution, and he implemented draconian laws limiting and restricting the power of the Catholic Church in Mexico. As a result, the bishops went on strike. They ordered all the priests to stop celebrating Mass in the country. The government retaliated against the bishops, and the Catholic faithful, the everyday Catholic laymen, rose up in rebellion. And this began a religious civil war in Mexico called the Cristero War. 24,000 women organized in female brigades to fight as combatants against the federal government in the Cristero War. Mexico was so torn apart by the Cristero Rebellion and its aftermath that Catholic action never really had a chance to develop. Here's a picture of some of the women who were fighting in the Cristero War. These are a couple priests that were martyred in the Cristero War, or martyred at least from the point of view of the Catholic Church. They were put up against a wall and shot for being priests, and they died crying out, "Cristo es el Rey," Christ is King. And that takes us to Colombia, which was another country torn about by religious and political upheaval and violence in the middle of the 20th century. The Catholic Church in Colombia had different experience. As I said earlier, the Conservative Party had been controlling the government from the 1890s through 1930s, when there was a split in the Conservative Party, allowing the liberals to win the election and take power. By 1944, there was a populist in the Liberal Party named Jorge Eliezer Gaitán, who was assassinated in Bogotá, leading to a 3-day rampage of violence called the Bogotazo. And there was an explosion of violence that even after the riots in Bogotá, it continued in the countryside between liberal and conservative partisans until 1956. It was the liberals versus the conservatives, and the Protestants versus the Catholics. In Mexico, the Catholic conservatives were being persecuted by a secular federal government, the revolutionary government. In Colombia, in contrast, it was conservatives who had come to power in 1948, and they were persecuting and fighting liberals who were rising up against them in a guerrilla warfare. And these liberals that were fighting in the guerrilla warfare tended to also include Protestants in their ranks, who were in favor of separation of church and state. And so, in addition to liberals versus conservatives, there was also an element of Protestants versus Catholics. Whereas there are Catholic martyrs in Mexico, there were also Protestant martyrs in Colombia, who were pastors and their families and other Protestant believers who were killed in the violence in Colombia. Colombia instituted an interesting solution in 1956 when the Popular Front came together and the liberals and conservatives negotiated an agreement where they would trade off the presidency every 4 years, I believe it was. So every 4 years there would be an election among the liberals, and that candidate would then become president, and then the conservatives would have an election and their candidate would be president. And that continued actually up until the late 1980s when I made my first visit to Colombia. Here's a picture of Pope Leo XIII. He was the last pope of the 19th century, and he was the pope who wrote Rerum Novarum in 1891. It was a papal encyclical dealing with some social issues that were, of course, creating divisions in that time. Hold on, I need to pause for 1 second. Yes, can I help you?
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I do apologize.
Can you come back in about 10 minutes?
Yeah.
I'm doing a recording. 10 minutes, thank you. 1891 Rerum Novarum, Rights and Duties of Capital and Labor. This was the foundation of the Catholic social teaching of the 20th century, which emphasized a social conscience and was critical of individualism and capitalism, as well as being critical of Catholicism. I'm sorry, not Catholicism, being critical of atheist communism or collectivism. Catholic lay organizations sprang up across Latin America, particularly among the workers. Jesuits helped found workers' unions in Colombia, and the Argentine conferences of the Ladies of St. Vincent de Pablo also dealt with issues confronted by workers. In 1931, Pope Pius XI wrote Quadragesimo Anno. He is known, Pope Pius XI, as the Pope of Catholic Action. His encyclical in 1931 was a celebration of 40 years since the encyclical of Rerum Novarum, and he attempted to reinforce the Catholic social teaching that began with Leo XIII. So this was the period of time in the 1920s when Pope Pius XI launched Catholic Action. Catholic Action began in Rome and spread to Spain, from where it spread to most of Latin America, including Cuba, and also a different version of Catholic Actions, which was called Specialized Catholic Action, began in Belgium and spread to France, then Quebec, and then to Brazil, as well as other countries. And these two branches of Catholic Action were an attempt to motivate or mobilize young people to become militantly involved as representatives of Catholic moral teaching in secular spheres, and to bring to bear Catholic influence in society, in the universities, in agriculture, in the labor unions. It was an attempt. This would be what you would call Neo-Christendom, an attempt to indirectly influence society through lay people. And in the original Catholic Action, the clergy kept a tight control over the organization. In Specialized Catholic Action, the students and workers had much more autonomy, and it was more class-based. This continued from the early 1920s up to the mid-1960s. I did my research and my dissertation on these organizations. This is Pope Pius XI, the Pope of Catholic Action. So Neo-Christendom was the primary strategy of the Catholic Church in the 20th century. Indirect influence, an attempt to influence or impose Catholic influence over society. 1935 in Lima, Peru, 200,000 people came together for a national Eucharistic Congress. After that, more national congresses were held in Mexico, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba. Brazil was chosen as the site of the first International Eucharistic Congress in 1955. These were large gatherings that basically were basically symbolic, and they impressed the importance of the Catholic Church and Catholic values on their respective countries. I've already talked a little bit about Catholic Action. Catholic Action had women's groups, men's groups, student groups, workers groups that were mentored or discipled or formed to become militant representatives or militant missionaries of the Catholic Church. The Pope's goal was to create an avenue for militant lay Catholics to defend the faith and evangelize in an increasingly secular world, and to influence the political process without being itself a political party. This is like walking a razor's edge. How to influence politics without becoming political. This new emphasis on social action as part of the practice of one's faith was not to the liking of the ruling oligarchies. They prefer the old emphasis on patronage and power. The Catholic Church had traditionally favored the ruling elites. As you read Justo Gonzalez, he'll talk about the two faces of the Catholic Church: those who fought for social justice and those who endorsed and collaborated with ruling political and economic elites. And so Catholic Action was a definite tilt in the direction of one side of that two-sided coin. This brings us to, I'm sorry, I'm doing the wrong thing here. Let me try going forward. Private Catholicism. So one of the other reactions or strategies of the Catholic Church in the 20th century was what we would call private Catholicism or popular Catholicism. And this included cursillos de cristiandad. Cursillo means a little course, a mini course or a seminar on Christianity. These were 3-day intensives where Roman Catholics, perhaps marginalized Roman Catholics, would go away for a 3-day retreat and come back converted to a deeper personal faith in Christ, in the Virgin Mary, in their Catholic religion. It began in Spain in the 1940s. There were also what's called popular Catholicism, which included retablos and ex votos and milagros. You see there on the left an example of a ex voto. Let me go back to it. This is a painting that someone commissioned to commemorate an accident where someone was killed on a bus and to request for prayer for their loved ones. That would be an ex voto. There's also retablos, are paintings that have a religious or theological message or content, symbolism, that are then posted in public places. If you saw, let me think, the movie Coco, You saw the family altar where pictures of ancestors who had passed away were placed. This is similar to a sort of private Catholicism where ancestors are venerated. Milagros are little charms which often are depictions of some part of the body, such as a hand or a foot or a heart. They were usually fashioned of metal and pinned to the clothing of the saint's statue or placed by the saint's altar as a reminder to the saint of a petition. For example, if someone had a heart problems, they might place a milagro of the heart. Let me see where that is. So here's a picture of some milagros. So this is, again, these are examples of popular Catholicism or what's called private Catholicism. And here is another example of a ex voto. You see there's a picture of a mother and her child outdoors at night. And the writing down in the lower left, which is in Spanish, it's translated here. My daughter was born with a rare disease that prevents her from receiving the sun's rays. So I had to organize a nightlife for us. The idea was difficult for me, but thanks to the Virgin of San Juan, we've gotten used to a paradise of moonlight. Instead of dogs, we have cats and canaries. I believe that when the time comes, my daughter will find a sensitive man who does not mind living at night. So these kinds of things would be painted and then hung on the wall as an expression of faith. Another group that the Catholic Church attempted to reach out to during this time was the book calls the Forgotten Ones. This is a picture of Carolina Maria de Jesus, who was a resident of a shanty town. She was raised in very humble circumstances. I think she became an orphan, and she did learn to read and write from on a plantation where a woman who felt some guilt about the consequences of former slavery made an effort to make sure that the people growing up on her plantation were educated. Maria Carolina de Jesus moved to Rio de Janeiro, where she lived in a slum known as favelas, and she would go around and gather up trash to try to support her and her child. And when she found scraps of paper, her house was made of cardboard, and when she found any kinds of scraps of paper, she would keep them and write a journal on these scraps of paper. A journalist eventually found her or discovered her and helped her edit her book and get it published. I believe it's called The Child of the Dark. I have a copy here. It's actually very good. So Carolina Maria de Jesus, Child of the Dark, her book was published, which brought some fame to her and some financial resources and allowed her to move out of the shanty town and to improve her quality of life. But she's an example of the masses of urban and rural poor who felt forgotten by the Catholic Church, which had traditionally focused on the upper middle classes and the economic and social elites. She was born the illegitimate daughter of a destitute black woman in the traditional interior of Brazil. She began her life with as many strikes against her as anyone could have in the mid-1910s. Portions of her diary covering the years from 1955 to 1960 were published in Brazil in 1960 after the efforts of a journalist brought the diary to light under the title of Quartillo de Despejo. The English translation is Child of the Dark. Her early religious experiences were not with Christianity, but with Spiritism, which is common of many. That would be common of many poor Brazilians. This is a woman who is a member of one of the Afro-Spiritist religions that are syncretistic or transcultural, probably Umbanda or Candomblé, could be Santería in Cuba as well. And so this brings another strategy to light, which was new faiths. In addition to the Catholic Church, and in addition to the explosion of Protestant Pentecostalism, which we'll talk about in future weeks, there was also other new faiths that emerged during this time that were transcultural syncretisms, is the one word I would use, or they were a mixing and matching of Catholicism and African worldviews. One of them in Brazil is called Umbanda Pura, which emerged in the 1920s. It was a combination of middle class and urban spiritists with Afro-Brazilian spiritism. The cult of the saints made Umbanda easier for the whites to adopt, because the names of the African deities were replaced with Catholic saint names, similar to Santería in Cuba. Candomblé is a more orthodox or traditional type of Afro-Brazilian religion, a little bit less Catholicism, more and less spiritism, perhaps, and more African spirituality. In Cuba, Santería was called the Way of the Saints. It's a combination of Cuban Catholicism and Yoruban religion. Sometimes animal sacrifices are required, normally chickens. La Virgen de Caridad de Cobre in Santería stands for Ochun, a mother goddess in the Yoruban religion of Africa. The Yoruban religion was practiced around Ghana and the western portion of Africa. It's widely practiced in Miami as well as in Cuba. And in conclusion, the Catholic Church lost its predominant place in Latin America in the late 19th century and the early 20th, and was on its way to some degree of irrelevance in the views of many people. It lost identity, and so the Catholic Church had to seek for alternative paths to having a social, cultural relevance and having a social identity. And so that included militant Catholicism with the Christian Democratic parties, and Catholic Action was one form that took through social activism. Protestantism also arrived and changed the face of Christianity in Latin America, shattering the Catholic religious monopoly. Populism was another strategy. New religious movements was a strategy for some people. Private spirituality or popular spirituality was another channel that Catholicism took in the 20th century. And also advocacy on behalf of the forgotten, the poor and the marginalized, was another form that allowed the Catholic Church to take a certain valuable identity in society. And that concludes our course for today. Let me just show you this picture of Transculturation by, there it is. Transculturation was a concept developed by Fernando Ortiz, a Cuban sociologist in the 1930s. And transculturation is the idea that, unlike acculturation, which is a one-way change or influence, transculturation is a two-way or mutual cultural influence. The larger circle reflects the dominant social society of Cuba, giving Cuba as an example of white and Catholic and European, influencing the African or black population of Cuba, which were there for forced labor. But at the same time, the African population also has a reciprocal influence on the white European population. And so you end up with a third area, a third society that's neither European nor African. Instead, it's both. And you see that reflected in the music, in Salsa, for example, which has European instruments and African rhythms. And you see that in a religion like Santería, where you have African influences, Catholic influences, mixed together. Okay. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.